All right, diving in today, folks, we're tackling Heinrich Rickert. And I think you'll find this one particularly fascinating, especially if you're drawn to those really big questions, how we know, what's real, the nature of value, that kind of deep stuff.
Yeah, he's definitely one of those thinkers who grapples with the fundamentals. Rickert, born back in 1863, is considered a key figure in neo-Kantianism. And there's something about his background that I think adds a really interesting layer to his intellectual journey. His father, you see, was a liberal Democrat, really championed the rights of German Jews, even founded a society to combat anti-Semitism.
Wow, that's pretty forward-thinking for that time, especially in Germany.
It was, and it really sets the stage for understanding Rickert's own trajectory, his support for Jewish philosophers, especially later on when they faced a lot of pressure.
So we've got these excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy as our guide.
Right. Think of it as our compass for navigating the intricate landscape of Rickert's thought.
Exactly. It's dense stuff. But our mission here is to really make it clear. Unpack it in a way that clicks for anyone who, enjoys a good philosophical deep dive.
That's the aim. We're going beyond the surface, exploring the nuances, the connections, the arguments that make his work so compelling.
Perfect. So first things first. Rickert's known as the head of the Southwestern School, sometimes called the Baden School, of neo-Kantianism. What makes this school stand out, especially compared to that other big branch, the Marburg School?
Good question. Both schools were all about, revitalizing Kant, reinterpreting him for their time, and they both really focused on this idea of validity, or Geltung, as it's called in German.
Validity, like how we determine what's true or justified in our thinking.
Exactly. They were all about figuring out systematically those a priori principles that make our thinking valid, whether it's in science, ethics, you name it, like laying the groundwork for how we understand the world.
Okay, so shared goal, but different methods.
You could say that. Both rejected those purely psychological interpretations of Kant, really emphasizing the objectivity of these a priori structures of thought, but they differed in how they saw Kant himself.
How so?
Well, the Marburg School, led by Hermann Cohen, they zeroed in on Kant's critique of pure reason, seeing it as the key to understanding Newtonian science.
Interesting. So they were very much connecting Kant to the scientific worldview of their time.
Yeah, and it's an interpretation that still resonates with some Kant scholars today. But Rickert and the Southwestern School, they took a wider view.
Wider in what sense?
They emphasized engaging with all of Kant, not just the critique of pure reason. They really saw the critique of judgment with its focus on aesthetics and teleology as crucial. And traditional metaphysical questions, those were front and center for them.
So for them, it wasn't just about the mechanics of the natural world, but also those bigger questions about experience, meaning ultimate reality.
Exactly. And Rickert even argued that fields like math and physics, they were sort of preparatory stages for the real work of philosophy, metaphysics.
Okay, I'm starting to see the difference here.
Yeah.
Marburg, focusing on the foundations of science. Southwestern School, taking a more expansive approach, bringing in those big existential questions.
Right. And this difference in how they understood Kant led to another key divergence. Rickert's student, Emil Lask, he summed it up beautifully, contrasting the Marburg School's panlogism with the Southwestern School's panarchy of logos.
Panlogism versus panarchy of logos. That's a mouthful. Break it down for me.
Think about Kant's distinction between intuition, that immediate sensory experience, and concepts, our understanding through thought.
Right, the classic distinction between the raw data of our senses and how our minds categorize and make sense of it.
Exactly. Now, Lask argued that the Marburg School, with their panlogism, basically minimized intuition. For them, even those basic sensory encounters, they could ultimately be reduced to, underlying thought processes governed by logical principles.
So everything boils down to logic for them.
Essentially, yeah. The mind was the ultimate foundation. But Rickert and the Southwestern School, they stressed the opposite, the irreducible nature of intuition. They said, sure, everything can be grasped by concepts. That's the panarchy of logos, the reign of reason, if you will. But nothing can be fully, completely captured by them. There's always something that remains beyond our concepts.
Sort of like the world always exceeds our attempts to fully define it.
Yes. There's always a residue, a bit of raw experience that defies total conceptual mastery.
That's a fascinating idea, and it seems to imply that our concepts, our ways of understanding, they're always selective, always just a partial grasp of reality.
Exactly. And Rickert really took this idea and ran with it. He argued that conceptualizing, it's an active process, like we're constantly recasting our sensory input into conceptual molds.
So we're not just passively receiving the world, but actively shaping how we understand it.
Yes. And we have to be selective. Think about it. Every time we conceptualize something, we're filtering out tons of information, focusing only on what's relevant to our specific purpose. Like if you think about the concept of linear motion, you're isolating things like speed and direction, but ignoring all the other sensory data bombarding you at the same time.
Makes sense. So it's about highlighting the limitations of our conceptual tools, recognizing that they can never fully capture the richness of the world.
Precisely. And this really lays the groundwork for Rickert's own theory of knowledge, which he saw as the foundation for his entire philosophical system.
Right. Rickert was all about epistemology or Kentis theory. He used terms like logic, methodology, even theory of science almost interchangeably with it. Why was the problem of valid thought so central for him?
For Rickert, you see, philosophy's most fundamental task was pinning down that subject-independent standard of knowledge. How does knowledge become objective? What is it that we actually know? He wasn't interested in debating those radical skeptics, those who say we can't know anything for sure. For him, knowledge clearly exists. Our thoughts can grasp something beyond themselves. That was his starting point.
Okay, so he starts by assuming we can know, and then asks, well, what is it that we can know? How do we define that which is knowable?
Exactly. And his argument was transcendental. He said, look, if knowledge exists and true thought grasps something independent of itself, then how should we think about that object of knowledge? He don't just assume that it had to be some transcendent reality out there independent of our minds, like, the classic idea of a mind-independent physical world. He really questioned that.
And where did that questioning lead him?
He ultimately concluded that this objective benchmark, it couldn't be some reality in the traditional sense. It was values that were truly transcendent. And to get there, he considered two ways to build a theory of knowledge: a transcendental psychological approach focused on the subjective act of knowing, and a transcendental logical approach focused on the objective realm of thought and its structures.
So two paths, one starting with the knower, the other starting with the known, the structure of knowledge itself.
Right. And initially, especially in earlier versions of his big work, The Object of Knowledge, he leaned toward that subjective path, really diving deep into the psychological processes involved in knowing.
Really analyzing how our minds work to produce knowledge.
Yeah, he was meticulous. He looked at all these subject-object dichotomies, like the difference between two physical bodies, between consciousness and its absence, between the ego and its representations.
Wow, getting really meta there.
He was. And he concluded that the problem of transcendence, it mainly pops up when we consider the difference between consciousness and what's not conscious. To get a handle on this, he introduced the epistemological subject, what he called consciousness in general.
Consciousness in general. That sounds pretty abstract. How's that different from my own, personal experience of consciousness?
It is abstract. Rickert defined it as this nameless, generic, impersonal kind of consciousness. It's not your individual mind with all its quirks and thoughts, nor is it your body and mind together as a physical being. It's more like the underlying structure of awareness itself, the capacity to experience anything at all, totally separate from any specific content.
Okay, so it's like the universal possibility of experience, the foundation upon which all individual consciousnesses arise.
Exactly. And he argued that the whole question of immanence and transcendence, it only makes sense when you're considering this consciousness in general, because something's immanent if it inherently have that form of being conscious, and something's transcendent if it fundamentally lacks that form.
So the question becomes, from the perspective of this consciousness in general, is there anything truly transcendent, anything that exists beyond it?
Right. And on that point, Rickert was a committed transcendental idealist. He wasn't buying into that psychological idealism, the idea that reality is just our individual minds making stuff up. But he didn't see a need to posit some transcendent reality totally outside of this consciousness in general either.
So he's saying reality, both physical and mental, is ultimately contained within this universal consciousness, not some separate, inaccessible realm.
Exactly. He even called his view true realism because, for him, it affirmed the reality of our everyday experience. It just rejected that classic split between an immanent mental world and a supposed transcendent reality that we can never truly know.
It's a kind of idealism that still takes the world seriously.
Yes. It's not about denying the existence of things, but understanding their ultimate status. And this led him to reject what he called the copy theory or pictorial theory of knowledge. It's the idea that knowing is basically like taking a picture, passively mirroring reality as it is. He saw that as way too simplistic. In fact, he found common ground with other neo-Kantians like Natorp and Cassirer on this point. To really drive it home, he brought in the distinction between form and content in cognition.
Ah, form and content, a philosophical classic. How did he apply that to knowledge?
He argued that, sure, knowledge involves content, the specific stuff in our thoughts, but what makes knowledge is its form. Take the statement, this paper is white. You're representing the content of whiteness, right?
Right.
But you're also using concepts like thing and property, saying white is a property of this thing called paper. Those concepts, they're not just given in the raw sensory data. They're imposed by the mind, giving form to the content.
So it's the act of judgment of actively structuring our experience with concepts that really matters for Rickert.
Absolutely. The copy theory, he said, completely ignores the form. The real problem of epistemology for him isn't just representing stuff, it's about the standard, the object of judging.
Okay, so judgment becomes this key act where we break free from just passively reflecting the world and actually do something with it.
Yeah, it's where transcendence comes in. He breaks down judgment into three parts. The psychological act itself, the objective content being judged, which has that timeless validity like 2 + 2 = 4, and this immanent sense that connects the two.
The immanent sense, so that's what guides our judgment, directs it towards the specific content.
Right. And remember that transcendent ought we talked about. That comes into play here too. Rickert, following Brentano, saw judgment as fundamentally an act of affirming or denying, a taking of a stance, an act of valuing. You're saying yes or no to something being true or false. And what motivates this stance taking? He argued it's this orientation towards certain requirements. Forderums. So what we affirm is true, it has to be situated within the realm of the ought, Sollen, this transcendent ought. And that leads us to the transcendent theoretical value of truth.
So truth isn't just out there waiting to be discovered, it's something we actively strive towards, a value that's built into the very structure of our thinking.
Precisely. But Rickert was honest about the challenges of this subjective approach. He saw that it could lead to a petitio principii, a circular argument. To really solidify his theory of knowledge, he turned to an objective path.
Meaning?
He started with propositions and their truth values, which exist independent of any particular act of judging. This way, you get straight to a transcendent value, pure validity, rather than just a requirement or an ought. He's very careful to distinguish those two. An ought is like a command directed at someone. A value just rests upon itself. It has this inherent validity.
So for Rickert, it's this transcendent value, this pure validity that's ultimately the object of knowledge.
Exactly. It's the unreal yet transcendent object grasped in any true judgment. And then he explains how those values can be linked back to subjectivity through that immanent sense, which bridges the gap between reality and value. And all of this, it's the foundation for his theory of science.
Which, if I remember correctly, focused on really clarifying the methodologies of different fields, especially defending the scientific status of historical studies.
You got it. Rickert was all about giving the historical sciences their due, defending them against those reductionist tendencies of positivism and naturalism. He was really inspired by Windelband's work, that distinction between nomometic and ideographic approaches.
Refresh my memory.
Windelband argued that the old way of dividing sciences based on their subject matter, like natural sciences versus humanities, it was misleading.
Because you could have something like art history, which studies human creations, but uses methods closer to, say, archaeology than psychology.
Yeah, good point. So he proposed a methodological distinction. Nomoletic sciences, they're all about finding general laws. Ideographic sciences focus on describing unique individual things, and the same subject could be studied both ways. Psychology could be nomolethetic, looking for universal laws of behavior. History is more ideographic, focusing on specific events, people, all that.
And Rickert took this and refined it further.
He did. First, he wasn't totally happy with that term ideographic because it seemed to suggest just a pictorial kind of knowledge, which didn't fit his view of concepts actively shaping our understanding.
Right, he was all about the active role of the mind.
Exactly. Second, while he agreed that methodology was the starting point, He also wanted a content-based distinction, something to replace that old nature-humanities divide.
Okay, so how did he define the task of a theory of science then?
For him, it was all about understanding how a science forms its concepts to deal with the immeasurable manifold of reality. Like, we're constantly bombarded with information, right?
Oh, tell me about it.
And science doesn't just passively mirror this. It actively selects and organizes this information using concepts.
So the way we conceptualize the world shapes what we see as scientifically relevant.
Yes. Now, for natural sciences, he agreed with Kant's view that they're fundamentally generalizing. They want to see individual events as examples of broader laws.
Moving away from the specific to the general.
Right. And individuality, he argued, that's what sets the limits for natural scientific concepts. Now, the flip side of this is what he called individualizing concept formation, which is what defines historical sciences.
Okay, so natural science is generalizing, historical science is individualizing. That's the core difference. But how did he define historical individuality? It's not just any unique thing, right?
No, he had a three-stage definition. First, very broadly, any unique thing is, well, unique, but that's not enough to make it historically relevant.
So what's the next stage?
Something that should not be divided because its uniqueness is tied to a specific value. He used the example of a lump of coal versus the Koh-i-Noor diamond.
Interesting comparison.
He argued that the diamond shouldn't be broken up because its valued, its uniqueness, is part of its cultural and historical significance.
It has a story, a context that makes it more than just a random piece of carbon.
Exactly. And the third stage, the historical individual, as studied by historians, it has to be something related to generally acknowledged cultural values, not just personal preferences.
Like the Koh-i-Noor's significance goes beyond someone simply liking shiny things. It's tied to all sorts of historical events, cultural narratives.
Right. So value and this idea of value relatedness, they're central to Rickert's distinction between natural and cultural sciences. He saw nature as value-free, the domain of natural sciences, and culture as value-laden, the domain of historical sciences.
So it's that reference to cultural values that makes something historically significant for him.
Yes. And he was really careful to distinguish between Wertung, which is like making a value judgment, something historians should avoid to stay objective, and Wertbesichung, which means relating something to a value, which is the historian's task.
So a historian shouldn't say whether Martin Luther was a good or bad person, but they have to acknowledge his significance in relation to things like religious reform, German identity, all those big cultural values.
Perfect example. Even if people disagree on Luther's character, his historical importance is undeniable. Rickert also pointed out that this doesn't mean natural sciences have no values. Logical values are definitely there, or that cultural sciences are totally devoid of generality. You know, they use general concepts, events happen in contexts, and you can study the history of groups, institutions, all that.
So it's not a rigid separation, more like two different ways of approaching the world.
Exactly. Now, Rickert actually had this long-running debate with Dilthey about this.
Dilthey, the champion of Geisteswissenschaften, who really emphasized understanding and even reliving psychic life to grasp history.
Yeah, Rickert argued that not all psychic life is historically relevant. It needs that value connection. And even if you could perfectly relive the past, that wouldn't necessarily equal understanding it historically. He saw that objective value relatedness as the key.
So for Rickert, it's not just about what happened in someone's head. It's about how those thoughts and experiences connect to broader cultural values and historical narratives.
Exactly. And he faced some pushback, too, from thinkers like Husserl and even his own student Lask. They raised some interesting points about how his framework dealt with subjectivity and the way natural science handles and maybe even distorts reality to fit its methods.
Right, there are always different perspectives on these big questions. Now, this focus on values leads us nicely to Rickert's philosophy of values itself and how it connects to his philosophy of history. He thought a strong philosophy of history needed a solid grounding in a system of values, right?
Absolutely. He wasn't convinced that psychology could provide that, but he was adamant that a good philosophy of history needs a set of universally valid values as its foundation.
A kind of framework for understanding the values that shape history.
Yes, and he insisted that this system couldn't just be based on looking at different cultures and generalizing from their values because those are so diverse and often contradictory. He thought philosophy had to go deeper, figure out what makes a value judgment valid in the first place. What are the formal preconditions for any value claim that goes beyond mere subjectivity?
So it's about finding those universal, formal principles of evaluation that underlie all the specific concrete values found in different cultures.
Exactly. And he stressed that the system should be open, flexible enough to accommodate a wide range of those concrete values.
A tall order, finding those universal principles. Did he actually attempt to create such a system?
He did, first in his paper on the system of values, and later in his system of philosophy. He started by looking at different kinds of goods, the things that embody values, and saw their creation and pursuit as driven by this human desire for completion. He also noticed that values give form to contents, which he saw as wholes made up of parts.
Okay, so values are like the organizing principles that shape and structure the content of our experience.
Yes, and this led him to identify three broad domains of goods: the uncompletable totality, fully completed particularity, and a synthesis of the two, each with a corresponding temporal dimension.
So like the totality might be something timeless, while the particular is situated in a specific time and place.
Something like that. Now he introduced another crucial distinction: contemplation versus activity. This cuts across those initial three domains, resulting in 6 fundamental domains of goods.
6. That's getting pretty complex.
It is, but it's also super interesting. He then fleshed out these domains with specific values, types of goods, subjective attitudes, and even worldviews. Like for each domain, he asks, what's the core value? What kinds of things embody that value? How do people relate to it? And what kind of worldview emerges from prioritizing that value?
Okay, walk me through those 6 domains.
So we have logic, with its value of truth, manifested in science, and associated with judgment and an intellectual worldview. Aesthetics, focusing on beauty, embodied in art, tied to intuition and aestheticism. Mystics, centered on impersonal sanctity, the all-one, associated with solitude and a mystical worldview. Then there's ethics, with its value of morality, manifested in communities of free people, characterized by autonomous action and moralism. Erotics, focused on happiness, found in loving communities, driven by inclination and devotion, and leading to eudaimonism. And finally, the philosophy of religion, with its value of personal sanctity, the world of God, characterized by piety and leading to theism or polytheism.
That's a comprehensive schema, and it shows how interconnected these different aspects of human life are, each with its own values, practices, and ways of seeing the world.
Exactly. And there are a few key insights here. First, he distinguished how values relate to their material in contemplation versus activity. For example, truth encompasses science, beauty encompasses art. These are contemplative modes. The value is sort of above its specific instances. But in practical modes, values pervade their materials, structuring them from within.
So, like, morality isn't something separate from ethical actions, it's woven into them.
Right. Second, Rickert saw his identification of erotics as a separate value domain as a big contribution. He thought it had been overshadowed by morality and deserved its own recognition.
So the value of happiness in loving relationships, it's distinct from the value of moral action.
Yes. Third, he gave religion a crucial role. For him, it provides those transcendent syntheses that help us deal with the tension between our desire for totality and our finite existence. Mysticism and philosophy of religion offer ways to reconcile those longings.
Interesting. And fourth,
he pointed to immanent syntheses that prefigure those transcendent ones. He saw love between a man and woman as one. Although, important to note, his understanding of gender was very much of his time.
Right, always good to be aware of the historical context.
And he saw philosophy itself as another immanent synthesis, a completed cultural good that contrasts with the open-ended nature of science.
Which brings us to his meta-philosophy, his view of what philosophy is and what it should do. He connected it to the idea of Weltanschauung, or worldview, but with a twist compared to the life philosophers.
Exactly. Worldview was a big deal back then, but life philosophers often saw it as this pre-theoretical, subjective thing tied to individual experience and history. They weren't big on philosophy being a strictly theoretical or scientific endeavor.
They were more about lived experience than abstract concepts.
Right. Rickert agreed that philosophy should aim to understand the world as a whole, the Weltganz, but he disagreed that this meant ditching scientific rigor. For him, grasping the world required concepts and logic.
So he saw a need for both, the expansive vision of a worldview and the precision of philosophical analysis.
Yes. He even said that only the one-sided, theoretically oriented man is able to reflect upon the world in its totality. Like, it's by taking that step back, that theoretical stance, that we can truly grasp the bigger picture. And his key tool for this was the heterological principle.
The heterological principle, what's that all about?
It's basically his principle of all principles, a way of thinking that he saw as crucial for understanding complex wholes. It involves using pairs of concepts that are mutually exclusive, but also totally comprehensive, like a thesis and its antithesis, but they work together to cover everything within a specific domain.
Give me an example.
Think about those two paths to a theory of knowledge: transcendental psychological and transcendental logical, or generalizing versus individualizing in science. These are heterological pairs.
Okay, I'm seeing the pattern.
Sure.
Two opposing but complementary approaches that together give you a complete view of something.
Right. And the test for a good heterological pair is that negating one concept should lead you to the other, ensuring everything falls into one category or the other.
No overlap, no gaps.
Exactly. He used the example of organic living bodies and dead mechanical bodies as a heterological pair that encompasses all bodies. And ultimately, he argued that the best heterological pair for understanding the world as a whole is reality and value.
Because anything that's not part of reality, whether physical or mental, it has to fall into the realm of value and vice versa.
Right. And this sets the stage for his later work on ontology and metaphysics. He actually went through what's been called an ontological turn in the 1920s, though he saw it as a natural progression.
An ontological turn. So he started focusing more explicitly on the question of being, of what exists.
Yes. He even defined ontology as the doctrine of what is predicated as being. And he was a big proponent of ontological pluralism, the idea that there are multiple fundamentally different ways of being.
Because we can say this exists about so many different things and they can't all exist in the same way.
Exactly. And his rigorous approach to epistemology actually supported this pluralism. It prevented him from reducing everything to just one kind of being. And during this time, he developed his framework of 4 kinds of being. Science jargon.
Which are?
Sensible being, non-sensible being, pro-physical being, and super-sensible being.
Okay, unpack those for me.
Let's start with sensible being. This covers both the physical world and the mental world, the things we can experience with our senses or our minds. And on the mind-body problem, Rickert leaned towards psychophysical causality rather than parallelism.
Meaning he thought the mind and body actually influence each other, not just run in parallel.
Right. He saw both the physical and the mental as belonging to the same basic category of being, with their specific differences being a matter for empirical science to figure out. He didn't like parallelism because it often involved trying to quantify the mental, which kind of defeats the purpose if you're saying they're fundamentally different.
Okay, so he keeps things unified within this category of sensible being. What about non-sensible being?
This is where things get really interesting. He used the example of word meanings to illustrate this. They're not physical things, nor are they just mental states. They're abstract concepts, part of what he called the mundus intelligibilis, the world of intelligible meaning, which exists alongside the mundus sensibilis, the world of senses.
So it's like the realm of ideas, concepts, meanings that structure our understanding.
Yes, and he stressed that this isn't some separate realm, it's part of our everyday experience. Think about music, math, art styles, all those things. They're not reducible to just physical stuff or mental states.
So the real divide for him isn't mind versus body, but sensible versus non-sensible.
Precisely. He called out what he termed hyletic sensualism, the idea that only sensory data is real. He saw the non-sensible as just as real, and often unified by values, like truth for true sentences.
Okay, so he's really challenging that materialist view that says only physical things are real. What about pro-physical being?
This one's tricky. He described it as pure content, Heil, before it's even differentiated into sensible and non-sensible. It's like the raw material of experience before it's categorized or organized in any way.
Pre-experience, in a way. And what of the pre-objective subject he talked about?
That's the active force behind all objectification, the thing that shapes this raw content. And he saw this realm as the domain of freedom, which helps to resolve that whole freedom versus determinism debate.
By saying they belong to different ontological categories, different levels of being.
Exactly. He even explored this Zustanslehre, a doctrine of pure states, suggesting there's plurality, even at this basic pre-objective level.
Always plurality with Rickert, it seems. And lastly, super sensible being.
This is the traditional realm of metaphysics, the ultimate connection of reality and value, but beyond our subjective grasp. He saw it as an object of faith more than scientific knowledge, but still necessary for our lives, both practically and theoretically.
So it's something we can't fully know but still need to believe in.
In a way, yes. He even called metaphysical knowledge allegoric or symbolic, like Plato's forms. He was careful to distinguish metaphysics from religion, though. Metaphysics is a theoretical thing, based on a kind of rational faith in a transcendent unity. Religion is about faith in a divine being.
So they're related, but distinct.
Right.
Wow, what a journey through Rickert's thought. We've gone from how we know to what exists, from the nature of science to the structure of values. It's a truly systematic and ambitious philosophical project.
It is, and we hope this deep dive has given you a good grasp of the intricacies, the connections, the arguments that make Rickert so fascinating.
And for those of you who really enjoy wrestling with these big questions, we'll leave you with a final thought. In our world, so dominated by scientific naturalism, that view that only the physical world is real, how might Rickert's focus on value-relatedness help us understand culture and history? And does his idea of a supersensible realm offer a viable alternative to materialism? These are questions worth pondering.
Definitely. And we encourage you to explore Rickert's work further, or even delve into neo-Kantianism more broadly. It's a rich philosophical tradition that still has a lot to offer. Until next time, keep those philosophical minds engaged.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.